understanding the SETT process. To understand the SETT process, we must first give credit to Dr. Joyce Apala. She is an educator who has done a lot of work in the areas of literacy and inclusive practices, as well as assistive technology to support students with special needs. She developed what's called the SETT framework. The purpose of that SETT framework is to provide a structure for gathering the data so we can make informed decisions about assistive technology. The four components to a SETT is the student, the environment, tasks and activities, as well as tools. And that's included for both your devices and services related to assistive technology. When you're considering the SETT framework, we have to take into consideration what assistive technology tools would be most appropriate for a student. What assistive technology would be most effective for a student, because keep in mind, what works for one student may not work for another student. We also have to consider what would not be effective or appropriate. So we really need to weigh the pros and cons of the different types of assistive technology for each student individually. If we don't think of it individually, some of the implications of not thinking through might be a mismatch of technology to the student need. So we're providing a tool for a student that may not meet the need that the student has. The lack of consideration of training necessary for a teacher or for a student. Sometimes if we jump to a more high-tech dynamic solution, it can automatically be setting that child up for failure, especially if the support people around him or her is not comfortable with the tool. The lack of consideration of your IT department at the district level, what type of support is needed for successful use of the technology. Inappropriate tools for the task that the student needs to accomplish. Sometimes if we pick the wrong tool for the student and then we don't see success, we say the student can't write, and we lower the goals or we lower the expectations when in fact maybe it's the tool itself that is not appropriate, and the student can actually be challenged more. So let's go back and talk a little bit more about that SETT process. It is a team-based process. It is not an evaluation, so all team members that are involved, such as the teacher, the regular ed teacher, the special education teacher, speech therapist if he or she receives speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, perhaps a behavior specialist. I always recommend the aide being part of, if the student has an aide, being part of the discussion, because they spend a lot more individual time with the student and can actually be quite a wealth of knowledge in how the student learns. The parents should always be considered as part of that team-based, multidisciplinary team. It may also include administrators or outside agency people, although some districts prefer not to do that. It should be looked at within the student's customary environment. So we want to look at what is currently going on a day-to-day basis for this student in the classroom, at school. What does that environment look like, and how can we meet the needs for the student within that customary environment? We want to look at the flexibility across a spectrum of tools. So we want to look at high-tech tools and low-tech tools. High-tech and low-tech both serve their own purposes and their own functions, and sometimes high-tech solutions may be more appropriate and more beneficial, where different scenarios, the low-tech may be more beneficial. And it's ongoing. So what works one year may not work the next year. The student may make a lot of growth academically, and so we need to find tools that can help to challenge that student a little more. The student may transition from an elementary to a secondary environment, so now the environment, the customary environment, has changed for the student, and the tools that worked before may not be working anymore. And even with technology itself, it's constantly changing and updating. So we need to sort of be on top of that, and it needs to be an ongoing process. What the SETT process is not is it is not an evaluation. It is not a review of other evaluations. It is a process. There is not a scoring rubric that gives you an answer. It's very individualized for the student, but it's not individualized as far as the people involved in the SETT process. Remember, I said it's a multidisciplinary, team-based approach. It should not be the teacher completing all of the answers or providing all of the information for the student. The information should be coming from the different specialists that work with that student. And it's not standardized. As I mentioned previously, what works for one student will not work for another student necessarily, or it may work very well. There's no scoring rubric. There's no standard deviation. Different tools. One tool may work for multiple students, but the way that it works for multiple students may look differently. So we really have to keep in mind that we're not evaluating a situation or a student. What we are looking at primarily is that individual student, the same as we do in IEP, and what needs to be done for the student. So who might be part of the team? I mentioned a little bit earlier who might be part of the team, but this is a nice little graphic that just gives you an idea of the variety of different people. It doesn't mean all of these people need to be involved, but this is just a snapshot of the people that may be involved. This AT, Assistive Technology Consultant, is where a lot of times the IU personnel may be involved, at least in the state of Pennsylvania. Some districts do have their own assistive technology consults that can be available, and what they really bring to the table is not so much an understanding of the student, but an understanding of all the different strategies and tools that might be out there and available, and they can help you in making that match for the student need and appropriate and effective tools. So if we break down the areas a little bit, let's first look at the student. What types of things are we looking at when we think about the student? Well, what is the area of concern for the student? Is it reading? Is it writing? Is it math? Is it communication? What does the student need to do they are currently having difficulty doing? What are some of the student's strengths and abilities? We don't want to focus too much on the negative, but we have to focus on where the needs are. What is the problem that the student is having in the learning environment? And I always encourage teams to really break down that learning environment. I have had students where math is a strong suit for them, but they struggle significantly with being able to write. So let's focus on what does that struggle look like, and what are the demands related to the struggle the student has, and what types of tools can we get to meet that need? What would success look like for this student? Remember, this is a reflection of the IEP, where maybe all students are writing 5-paragraph essays, but that's not the expectation for the student right now as far as the goal of the IEP. What are all the other students expected to learn? It should still have some tie-in with the curriculum and what is happening in the classroom, but we have to keep in mind that the student has their own goals, individual goals that they're working on. Environment might have to do with the arrangement of the room. So for kids who are physically impaired, this is a big ordeal for them as far as physically accessing the room, but also for them to benefit instructionally from the teacher, they may need to have a specific preferential seating. Supports, who's available in the room, both students and the staff, materials and equipment. What are some commonly used by others? Are laptops used? Are iPads used? Are textbooks being used? If they're using a computer, where is that computer in reference to where the student sits? Is it a laptop that can come to the student? Is it in a cart? We just have to take all these things into consideration. Access issues such as physical and instructional, but also technological. If you have students all using computers or all using iPads and you have a child with a physical disability, what's that going to look for the child? We don't want to make the assumption that because they can't access the computer, that means they cannot do the same work that all the other students are doing, because perhaps cognitively they can. So how can we arrange, what types of supports can we find to support the access? Attitudes and expectations. We lump that in with environment because that can make a difference of how comfortable the person feels in the environment. And if they see, I have some kids that are very hypersensitive to seeing what all the other kids are doing. And if we move them to a different spot because it's easier for the staff or for the other kids, that's not really being fair to that student. So when we think of tasks, we think of what are the specific things that student needs to be able to do or learn to be actively involved in the learning experience and to be able to make educational progress. So what are the learning activities typically occurring in that environment? It may be things such as writing a lab report, writing a 5-paragraph essay, completing worksheets, reading novels, etc. What are the activities to support that student's learning goal? What are the current barriers to the student accomplishing that task? What is it that's holding that kid back? Is it that he needs to be reading grade level material, but his reading level is significantly lower? But from a listening comprehension standpoint, he can understand the material. What are the critical elements of the activity, and how might we modify to accommodate for that student's needs? And tools we kind of break up into two parts. Tools we look at, what are the current tools? What are the low-tech, high-tech, best practices, even for that matter, that are currently being incorporated into each one of the learning environments? What accommodations are you using for that student? A lot of that information you can get as far as best practices from the teacher, but then also specially designed instruction that may be listed out in the student's IEP. What is working and what is not working, and why is it not working? That can be a big clue to us when we're looking for other tools to know what works for the student, because we sure don't want to try a tool that we already know is going to fail for whatever reason because it's something similar to what they've tried before that may not be appropriate or effective. And then part two, this is really where your AT consultant can really come in and be beneficial, because this is the area where you're going to talk about tools to explore. What strategies might be used to support and increase student performance? How might these tools and strategies be tried out? So this is an area where it's, you're going to be doing brainstorming a lot of possibilities for trial. So when we talk about tools to explore, it's exactly that. It's to explore, which means you want to do a trial. I work with a lot of districts who look for me to give a recommendation, and my recommendation is golden. And I try to explain to them that I may come up with 10 to 20 suggestions, but it does not mean that those 10 to 20 suggestions are all going to work for the student. They are simply tools that perhaps have worked in the past. It may be something that's new, that's out there, that seems like it might be a perfect match for the student. But the only way we can really find out is if we do a trial and determine and collect some data to determine the effectiveness and appropriateness of that tool. So this is just a nice little graphic to help you kind of see this 20%. And this is really looking at the yellow part. It's the part of why we look at a multidisciplinary team. And that yellow part is really the school team, and including the parents, that can really provide a rich amount of information about that student, about how that student functions on a day-to-day basis, about how that student is interacting in the classroom and in their educational learning environment. That green part is really, as I kind of mentioned, tools to explore, is where your AT consultant can probably be most beneficial, because they may be privy to more tools and strategies or technology solutions that are out there that may be beneficial for a student. So one of the things we like to also, when we're talking about assistive technology, is this separation between instructional or assistive. So there's a lot of instructional technology tools out there that can be assistive technology tools. Instructional technology is generally used by all students. So Microsoft Word is generally an instructional tool that is used by all students. It's meant to help enhance the learning for the writing process. But for some students, it could also be an assistive technology tool, because if that student struggles with being able to write with pencil, to complete worksheets with pencil, being able to scan that into a Word document, which is what all the other students are using, that student can then type their answers or their responses and save it electronically. So when the student is using it in a non-typical way, then all the other students are using it. Suddenly it becomes assistive technology because the student may not be able to perform that task if they do not have access to the ability to do it in a digital format, say on Microsoft Word. It allows students to overcome those barriers that enable them to actively participate in the learning environment. So it's more of a necessity. It's not an enhancement. It's not a benefit. It's they need this or they won't be successful. And this is just another little graphic of some of the different tools out there that we use every day. I know all of them on here I use every day in my work environment. But for some students, there are ways that these tools could be used that may actually make it a necessity for them to access the curriculum in the environment. So technology does not replace good instruction, and that's really important quote. It makes good instruction more accessible, and that's how we have to think about with this, not just regular technology, but also assistive technology. Sometimes I've had teachers say to me, well, we'll put them on the computer during this time and they can do their program. Well, then they're missing out on really good instruction. Most times when I hear them saying that, what they're doing is they're putting the student onto the computer to do some type of drill and practice, flashcards or something of that nature, which serves its purpose, but they miss out on the instruction and learning strategies that are being taught to all the other students. So we don't want the technology to replace that good instruction and even to replace the participation in the classroom. But it may be that technology is making it more accessible for students with significant disabilities. There's a little graphic. Whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to pause and reflect. And to me, this was just kind of to let you know that, you can't judge a book by its cover. And you would be surprised sometimes with a little bit of assistive technology, low tech and high tech, that you can see a whole different side of a kid that you didn't even know existed. At the SETT process, the first area I mentioned we look at is the student. So what's the purpose of the referral? Why are we looking to explore assistive technology for the student? Is it to support written expression? Is it to increase communication, participation in the general education environment? Is it for community-based instruction and helping them function in the community? You may want to look at some of the academics. How are they doing? What are their levels academically? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Where do they need that support? This really should just be like a snapshot in the day in the life of this student in their customary environment. It doesn't have to be a lot of standardized scores from a school psychologist, but more, what does it look like on a day-to-day basis for this student? What are the gross motor or fine motor skills? So if the student's receiving OT or PT, what is that occupational therapist or that physical therapist doing with them in the school? What kinds of things are they working on with them? What kind of skills are they trying to help support them with? Again, this should be kind of a snapshot of how is the student accessing that environment and how are they engaging in their academic setting in relation to fine motor or gross motor skills. Behaviors. Does the student have any behaviors that might impede his ability to learn or impede the ability to learn of others? And, if they have an FBA, what are some of those behavior goals they're working on? Communication. If the student does receive speech and language services, what is the student's receptive language? What is the student's expressive language? How is communication affecting their ability to make academic growth or participate in that general education environment? Other things, medication. I sometimes ask this question because if a student is in the process of, they're doing a lot of playing with medications or they're trying different medications for a student, that can affect medications can affect the way a student is performing and how they may perform during a trial. Does the student have any visual or hearing challenges that may affect their ability to learn? Just more or less, what are some of those extraneous things aside from, academic that may affect their ability to learn both in school and even outside of school? What are some student interests? I always ask this question because sometimes finding out what motivates that student can really be a strong way of, if you're doing a trial, you can use those areas of interest and those areas that are most motivating for that student to try to make the trial more successful. So if you're trialing some type of a writing tool with a student and the student loves baseball, maybe you're going to have them writing about baseball. Or, because that's something that they're interested in and you want them to learn the tool first. And then once you know the tool works, you can try to expand it and generalize it into other areas. Parent considerations. I've said before that, parents are a part of the team, so you want to take into consideration what are the parents' concerns. What does the parent see at home? Sometimes I have schools that say, the student is doing just fine at school, but the mom says the kid is struggling with homework, struggling to do anything at home. And, so what does that look like? What does a snapshot of the day in the life at home look like, especially surrounding homework and surrounding what the student does outside of school? Sometimes I have parents come to meetings, sometimes they don't, but I ask that at least have written input, whether it's from a phone conversation or it's from email or some way to get the information and this parent's perspective to be part of the document, part of the framework. So environment, again, where does the student have the most difficulties? Are there special concerns with the physical arrangement? What supports are already available, just kind of looking at all those areas of the environment. And sometimes I tell people to look at it class per class. So if the student's in middle school, I say, let's look at each one of the classes separately. What does science look like? What are some difficulties in science? What's some physical arrangement of the classroom in science that may cause difficulties? What are the materials that are being used and how would they access them, and do they need to be using a computer? But I sometimes tell teams to look at each one of the environments separately. And then task, what does the student need to do? What specifically is it that the student needs to be doing? Do they need to be able to write 5 sentences on a topic? Do they need to be able to complete work on a worksheet or keep a daily journal? Do they need to be able to read material on grade level and have access to material on grade level? What can the student not do or do they struggle to do that the other students are doing? And we want to be specific because we want to try to, keep them doing the same rigor of the curriculum as we can and still meet the needs. So what are the tools that they're using? So what accommodations or strategies are you already in the students' specially designed instruction and listing those out? What's working, what's not working? You may have a lot in here. Is the student receiving a modified curriculum of some sort or an adapted curriculum, and how's the student performing with that curriculum? And then that last tools to explore, again, is where you're thinking of possible tools for consideration. These are tools that you would explore, from a very a large spectrum of possibilities. And the tools may work effectively in some environments, but not in others. So a laptop may be something that's very beneficial for a student to use during science, but during math, it may not be a best solution, so we need to think of it different tools that may work for that student during a math environment. So it might have to be multimodal, and there's not going to be a magic bullet. There's not going to be one thing that's going to serve the best possibility for every situation. And we've talked about the student, and we've talked about the environment and the tasks and the tools that we're going to look into. Now what? Now what do we do? What is the next step in this process? Well, the next step is we want to take a look at an action plan. So we want to collaboratively develop an action plan that will help us to decide what needs to be done and who will be responsible for doing it so that we can do this trial with whatever assistive technology tools and solutions the team has discussed and decided might be most effective and appropriate for a student. We have to look at, though, if you're using an iPad, who's going to get the iPad? Who's going to get a hold of it, acquire it? Who's going to make sure that the apps are available? Who's going to make sure that the iPad is available for the student when the student needs it? Who's going to provide training to the staff on how to use whatever apps or whatever way that the iPad's going to be used for the student? Who's going to be there to show the staff how to implement it? If we're working off of independence or prompting, who's going to model that for the staff? How's data going to be collected? So if we are doing a trial, we want to make sure that we're collecting data to determine, is this effective and is this appropriate for a student? What's that data going to look like? Who's going to be collecting the data? Who will review the success of this plan? So just any of the steps that are going to go into making an action plan for a trial, you just sort of want to lay that out. We want to be making data-informed decisions, so we need changes targeted for the data collection need to be observable and measurable. So most administrators I know don't really love anecdotal records only. Anecdotal records are great, just to give them a feel of how the student is performing. But most administrators, especially if it's going to cost some money, they want to see some concrete evidence and data that's going to support that the student is making progress and the tool is effective. So data might be collected on the accomplishments of identified tasks, which may be linked more to the IEP goals. It may be collected on student preferences, and I always tell teams that I think it's a good idea to do a rating, especially as the kids get into middle school and high school, is how does the student feel about using that tool? Even if it's the best tool in the world for the student and it would work perfectly for them, if the student does not feel comfortable with using it, it's not going to be successful. Participation, productivity, what kind of end output might we have that would be a good way to measure data? That may be something along the lines of written work, like a composed essay. But make sure you have a baseline data to show what did it look like before, what did an essay look like for that student before we started implementing a tool, and now what's it looking like after we've implemented a tool or strategy. The independence, if the student requires a lot of prompting, does that prompting fade over time? Can the student begin to do a little bit more independently? Or is the expectation of complete independence not realistic for that student regardless of whether you're using an assistive technology or tool or not? The quality of the work, student satisfaction, sometimes speed and accuracy of the performance. There's probably more out there. These are just some examples of what you might want to collect. Here's a link to just some resources that maybe that are out there that are data collection samples. That if you are struggling, you can always go to one of these links and take a look at it. So my suggestion would be, is if you're watching this video, just pause it right now and maybe jot down some of these links. So at the end of that trial period, the team is going to review that collected data. Now, depending on the type of tool and depending on the student, how long you actually trial may be different for every student. I generally say a 6 to 8 week window is pretty good. Keeping in mind that the first couple of weeks sometimes is getting all the kinks and the bugs out. So it's the learning curve for the student, it's the learning curve of the person introducing the tool, it's making sure you're collecting the data the way you want the data to be collected, it's making sure that everything's going to work smoothly, so that then once you get maybe over that 2-week hump, then it starts being a little bit more of a smooth transition and you can collect some data at that point. For some students, it takes them a little bit longer to acquire skills or to learn something new, so the trial may end up being extended a little bit longer. For some kids, as soon as you introduce the tool to them, they take to it right away, and in a few weeks, this is working perfectly. So usually the 6 to 8 week window is just a guide, but it's not anything that's set in stone. And then based on the results, as again, the team, you should be reviewing this as a team. It shouldn't be one teacher or one therapist just looking at it, but the team coming back and looking at the data. And from that, you'll say whether the assistive technology may or may not be a good recommendation for this student. So, just sit and reflect for a couple minutes. What are some other key considerations that you need to be thought of and worked out for an assistive technology trial to be successful? They could be things such as, does the student need to have access to an internet for a tool? I know like when you use the iPad for any of the speech recognition apps or even just the built-in voice dictation for the newer iPads, you need to have internet access to use it. So if that's a type of tool that you want to trial with a student, you're going to have to make sure that there's internet access for that student. And some districts don't allow outside devices to be accessing their internet and their network. So it's things like that you just need to think about. Could have to do with family dynamics. If you're looking at communication, is this something that you're just going to try in school, or are you going to allow for it to go between home and school? Knowing that you would be taking responsibility for any items that you're trialing from an outside organization, but is that something that you feel would be more beneficial for a student? And then sometimes you need to do a reset. And by that we mean you may have to go back and revisit the set. So what was known before may have changed. The student moved. Meds were changed. The student started seeing a new teacher. The student recently had surgery, so therefore what might have been known before as far as what you thought would work for the student isn't going to work because the surgery is going to be a setback for them. Learning expectations or the environments may have changed. New people may be involved, especially if you have kids who have TSSs, and sometimes that can be a revolving door of individuals. And sometimes they get good matches and sometimes they don't. Is there any new questions or information that might have emerged? Are there more specifics that may be available? Are there new technologies that may be available? Or even a matter of you've done a trial and the trial wasn't successful. So you might be revisiting the set to say, okay, what we thought might work wasn't going to work, so let's go back and look at what we said before and see if there's something different. And that's kind of taking the information that you did before in the set and the data you've collected from that first trial and kind of trying to tweak new solutions and new tools that might be beneficial. So you've done a trial. You've collected data. Now what are you going to do? This is another now what? Where are we going to go from here? AT look like in the IEP, both in the process, so when we're exploring it, and both in the document once we have determined that the tools and strategies that we have trialed are effective and appropriate for a student to make academic progress and to continue supporting them in the classroom. So some possible AT considerations. Might be that AT is not needed. So we may do a trial and determine, you know what, there's no difference in all the assistive technology we've tried. There's no difference. The student prefers to do it the way they were doing it before, and it's not needed. AT is in use and is effective and sufficient as specified in the IEP. The team does not have enough information to make a decision and will, as specified in the IET, introduce some more trials for the AT. And you may also add that you're going to obtain consultation or assessment. Some of this might be in play as before you even have done your trial and that you're considering the assistive technology. So what do we specify in the document? Well, under special considerations, we may mark it under present ed levels, participation, state and local assessments, transition services, goals, modifications, related services, supports for personnel. These are all areas where assistive technology may be documented, whether it's in the process part of assistive technology, meaning that you're currently trialing or going through the process of trying to find the appropriate tool, or if you've already found the right tool and you want the student to have it documented in the IEP so that they'll be using it to support them. In the present ed levels, it may be marked off as part of their academic achievement. It could be part of their functional performance, so the student uses a tool such as a laptop to complete or participate in any writing task. It may be listed under how the student's disability affects the involvement and progress in the general ed curriculum. So, due to the child's diagnosis of cerebral palsy, the student needs the use of a laptop for any writing tasks. Sometimes I even have teams that will write in the SETT process under this to say that the team is currently in the process of going through the SETT process to explore assistive technology to support written expression for the student, or whatever area that they may be looking for assistive technology to help support. Participation in the state and local assessments, you want to identify the appropriate accommodations necessary to measure his or her academic achievement. The allowable accommodations should be specified, and to add to that, the allowable accommodations should be assistive technology accommodations that are already being used in the IEP. If the child never has used a laptop or has never used voice dictation for writing assignments, then it should not all of a sudden be popping up as part of their participation in the state and local assessments. It should only be assistive technology tools that are used regularly with the student and is documented in the IEP as such. During transition services, so at age 16 federally, but at age 14 in PA, may be appropriate measurable post-secondary goals related to the training, education, employment where appropriate, IEP goals that coordinate with the transition goals, services needed to assist the child in reaching these goals. Assistive technology can easily be embedded in any of these situations. So if the student is looking to do employability, perhaps there's assistive technology that needs to be explored for helping that student to be able to communicate during an employment situation. Or if it's independent living skills and it's a difficulty with accessing, it could be something as simple as, using a specialized key to be able to open a lock, or to use a telephone that has enlarged buttons on it because the student's visually impaired and needs to have that specialized phone to be able to see, to be able to dial. So there's a lot of ways that you could embed different types of assistive technology within the transition services. It may be part of the measurable annual goal, so it's typically a tool for achieving a goal. You don't write goals for the assistive technology. The assistive technology should be a tool to reach a goal. The goal should be set based on a need that has been discovered that the student has through evaluations and through student work. So the assistive technology should be a tool, the same as any accommodation, that's helping that child to master or become proficient at a goal. So, for instance, if the student has difficulty with writing, they should have a writing goal, and the assistive technology should only be a tool that helps them to meet whatever that writing goal may be. Specially designed instruction can be listed with the goal, or it can be listed under the SDIs. So that's just something to keep in mind, is we may actually see assistive technology, the same thing, listed in both situations. Special education related services, this is where you may see it, program modifications, specially designed instruction related services, supports for school personnel. You may see assistive technology for supports for school personnel, where it may be training with an AT consultant on a monthly basis on software updates, or just as a check-in to make sure that the assistive technology tool is being implemented appropriately. Some SDI examples might be a voice output communication device and activity-based communication boards. A location would be across all school locations and school field trips. When is it being used daily? When is it beginning? Well, as soon as the IEP date the duration. Or if you're already through the IEP and you're halfway through the IEP and you discover this tool is necessary, you would do the date when you are going to begin using that tool. Your duration date would still probably be the end of the IEP, at which time you would revisit the tool again and make sure it's still working best for the student. Trial the use of software to increase length, legibility, and vocabulary in targeted writing assignments. Again, location, frequency, beginning, and duration. Related services refers to services that assist the child, and it may include assistive technology services in here. So if this service doesn't fit in another area, and it may be in some instances where consultation for augmentative communication with the speech therapist may be something that needs to happen because the speech therapist struggles with using a more dynamic assistive augmentative communication device. And you generally would see that any type of training would be listing for supports for school personnel would be listed under here. It may be training in the use of a particular product or bringing in a vendor to provide that training. So, very briefly we went through what it might look like in an IEP. So in summary, it's that you consider it for every student with an IEP. Under that section of special consideration, you always want to consider whether the student needs assistive technology or not. And, quite frankly, I don't know of any student, whether they have an IEP or not, that couldn't benefit from something that would be considered assistive technology. It's just a matter of how that would be documented in the IEP. Seek help if you need it. There's AT consultants in the different IUs, at least in the state of Pennsylvania. They have a couple, usually with each IU, that can come out and help, as well as a lot of third-party organizations that could help with that. Trial the use of it. If you need help with doing the trial, find those people it doesn't always have to be an AT consultant. It could be someone else from within your district or your building that can help support that. You want to document that AT in the IEP and just be clear about the actual function and purpose of the AT and how it relates to the goals and the needs of the student. You want to make sure you're informing all team members of what that looks like, and so that everyone is being consistent and helping to support the child in the best way possible. And you want to revisit AT as it's needed, because remember, this process is not a one and done. This process is an ongoing process. Thank you.